Hi there, I'm Scott Brown, a solo developer for the game Journey for the Crown, and this is my 6th devlog. In this devlog, I'm going to be going over some of the things that I added and changed in this zone. The first thing I started doing was just putting some graveyard plots around the zone, because the game's about undead, there's a necromancer, and there was a war a long time ago, so I kind of played into this story that there was some fallen soldiers and they had to bury them, and there was hundreds and hundreds of them, so I decided to make this zone filled with graveyards, and we'll have some of these fallen soldiers come back to life now that the necromancer is becoming a problem again. So here we are. I'm just kind of like copying and pasting some stuff and just reorganizing where they go, just so they look unique instead of just copying each one by one. I've got a whole bunch of these different assets, you know, tombstones. Some of them are just like obelisks, and some of them are, you know, there's a whole bunch. I also added some fencing in there that kind of has little areas where it's kind of disappeared, the fencing, just to give it an aged look, and I think it works pretty well. So here I am adding some enemies, and I made a whole bunch of different kinds of skeletons. These are all going to be different fallen warriors. So I've got a drummer, which is kind of like your healing skeleton, and there's some sword and shield ones, and a mage and an archer. Now I added this feature where you have a random chance of getting an additional skeleton in here, and these ones I'm going to be using as like rare mobs, that sort of thing. And I end up changing their names around, even though they host the same abilities and that sort of stuff. They just have a different nameplate just to make it look different, right? So I end up changing the name here, and then I'll also assign a different color, because by default a normal or a regular enemy will just have a white name. Here I'm going to change it to amber. And I also like to add a little outline to it, so there's like a stroke effect on the name. It just gives it a nice little enhanced look to the name. So I'm going to spread them out, make sure that they're not residing in the same spot when they're turned on in game. Otherwise they could get stuck or something like that. So here we go. I just put in this little outline effect, which is a built-in function with Unity. I was surprised to see it, but look at that. It looks really good. So now I gotta add some items to this guy. I ended up having an old script called load XML items. And inside here, I used to load things with just a giant text file. Now I'm using scriptable objects. And here I'm just adding a ceremonial belt, which is, it's a really nice item. It's an item that instead of having like a spread of stats on it, it's kind of got a couple stats that are really, really high that you would probably not find on a different type of item that had a lot more stats, right? It would be like maybe 5 or 10. But this one, I wanted it to be a little different. It's more of like a vitals item. So if you have a character that's a little low on health, this thing would be an essential item to have, just to make sure you don't die so quick. So I gotta make sure that I also turn on the rate of dropping here. So I'm checking off the random rare items, and I'm just going to put in a value here. Because this bad guy is very rare himself, I'm going to make sure that he drops it 100% of the time. And I'm also just going to lower the trash amount too, because every enemy in the game has a chance to drop something. It could just be trash, could be potions, and in here I'm just going to change that rate of this bad guy showing up. So when you trigger that little area, he might not show up. He's got like it looks like an 8% chance right now to show up. So now that this area is all done, I gotta do this for the rest of all the little trigger areas in this zone. That little bubble there, once you walk in there with your character, that's gonna trigger the combat of those 4 bad guys. It's a very simple trigger. It's nothing too complicated. But that's kind of the idea of how this stuff's triggered. Now, the next thing I added was I wanted to, and I discussed it in my last video, where was I going to make static encounters, or I'm going to have things just like dynamically populate bad guys throughout the zone. So I think I'm going to do a mixture of the two. I think that's It's a nice balance between them. And so I added this script here called Random Secrets, which I use for so many different things. I can use it for bad guys. I can use it for like dropping corpses that you can loot, and even crafting ingredients like nodes for prospecting. And I developed this script which uses a gizmo as a targeting area. So this little yellow box that you see here is actually where it's going to check if there's land to put something down on, and it's just checking by a tag, and it's raycasting from a very high range in the sky. So I do have to make sure when I do put my terrain down that it's always around the same height, otherwise this wouldn't work. So now that I've got this position in a good spot, I'm going to resize it so that I can ensure all the bad guys are going to be inside this graveyard area. Now I don't want to have any of them showing up on the pathway. I want the paths in my game to be kind of like safe areas, unless I've got some sort of special need for it. But that's the idea here. When you kind of go into shortcuts and things like that, you can run yourself into a little bit of trouble. So they look like they're populating inside the square, so that's good. And they do get parented inside the parent of the Random Secrets script. And you can see here that they're all in there. They all have their individual script that when you trigger it with your character by walking into that circle, the skeleton drummer, which is right here, will appear and you'll start attacking. Now the next thing I wanted to do was simplify how I create higher level enemies. Now originally I was just kind of going in there and adding stats to every enemy in the game, and all these fields, it starts to add up on a lot of time to having to come up with all this stuff and then document it. So instead, I have those fields still for if I want to enhance the default stats, but now I've got some values that'll just come up based on their level. And then if I need to add some more health to say it's like a boss or something like that, I can still do that. Now that that's all done, I wanted to create an underground crypt in this zone. So I came up with this cool looking little crypt area here. And it's going to have an entrance. Now this entrance is going to be available to you unless you possess the options to go through. Now in this case, I have an option here that if your strength is a certain value, you're going to get this option to open the door. And there's other options as well, like if you're a dwarf or a half giant. So there's a variety of different ways to get through here, and each of them could possess a possible reward. In this case, it's just simply opening the door. So I've got that set, and I click on the door, and here she goes. She opens up. Now that's going to trigger, and it's going to be all part of the save function too. So once you've done that little choose your own adventure dialogue series, it'll always be remembered in the game. So when I go to save my game later on, it'll also be taken care of. Now here I am just messing around with some of the higher level NPC or enemies in here, and you can see them completely dust me. Their stats are now being taken in there properly, and I'm only level 5. So I'm obviously going to get whooped when I walk through here. But with that being said, there's not a whole lot of options I can really do to avoid combat when I'm in the wrong area. So what I did is I developed this level trigger, and this is very similar. It's using the sphere function that I had with my combat. And using that same kind of technology, I decided I wanted like a UI pop-up that would warn you when you're in an area that's going to be very dangerous for you. Now it pops up for no matter what level range you're at, and it just lets you know. And it also changes its color so that if it's red, it kind of is more alarming than if a green one pops up. So here I am just putting down all these little triggers here. Now it is like, it would be great if I could just throw a giant square down, but because of the contours of this path, I wanted to make sure that everything fit in there perfectly, and I didn't want it to trigger it when you were going down the path, because I wouldn't mind if somebody walked down this path just to explore a little bit further, and if they were to venture through this area here, they would get a warning and possibly turn around. So I have a few of these set up in this zone, and I also introduced this because I wanted people to come through zones not just one time, but I wanted them to come back later on. And when you when you're wandering around and you're finding these little areas, I think it's going to be really neat to see something that you can't do yet, but maybe later on. You know, I'm very fond of my experience with RPGs in my life, and I always thought it was really interesting when you found areas that you wouldn't be able to tackle now, but you'd have to later. And those are some of those moments that really resonate long term with the enjoyment of these kinds of games. Now here I'm just testing out the level range and the coloring. So I'm level 5, and it shows up as a red pop-up. And I'm just going to show you after I level myself up here to about level 15, 20, give or take. When you walk back through that area, it should trigger as a green warning. So that means you're good to go. Now I also didn't want to have this constantly trigger on and off, so I developed a little trigger here that would remember if you've walked through there, and you should already know. So that was added in there just to prevent going back and forth over that trigger zone and getting that annoying pop-up. I think it's informative, but you wouldn't want to be bombarded with that thing every time you crossed over. I think one of the coolest things I added was the ability to charm undead. I added this in here because I think charming was a really neat function. It took a ton of changes to my code to make it work. I technically had a working version that had tons of bugs in it years ago, but I fine-tuned that, and I think I've got it all ironed out. But basically, how it works is it uses charisma as its like failure check. You originally have a magic check when you cast it, so it's looking at that resist check, and then it's got a clock that starts that checks if it's going to just drop or continue, and it uses charisma as that value to continue moving forward. Now it's really neat. You can see here that the drummer is on my team now, and he's dropping heals. He's got a pretty gnarly looking heal that heals the whole group. He's technically a bard. That's kind of what he is. He's got his drum and he's singing songs. And here you can even actually turn the charm off if you want to, like I just did, manually, or you can just let it keep running. Now, the next problem I was running into is, what do I want to do when someone decides to zone out with a charmed enemy? I decided that I don't want the charmed enemy to go with you. It's just going to disappear. That's my idea of fixing it, because I didn't want people finding like this epic charmed mob and dragging it over to a very difficult boss encounter and just making it a cakewalk. Now that wraps this up. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, head on over to Steam and wishlist the game. You can see the link in the description of my video here. Now I also spend time on Twitch every weekend on Saturdays around 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can see me do all sorts of stuff like 3D modeling and all sorts of other game design stuff. So hopefully I'll catch you there as well. Anyways, I hope to see you in the next episode. Thanks.